I've come to realize that for basically my entire life, including this very moment, I've had low emotional intelligence, and I'm not very happy about that. It's uncomfortable for me to talk about because it's a relatively recent realization and acceptance for me. So when I'm experiencing an emotion, whether it's happiness, sadness, irritation, frustration, anger, as I'm experiencing the emotion, I have a hard time identifying the emotion as it's happening, identifying what's causing it, or even just expressing the emotion. It's those less pleasant emotions that are the problem, because nobody looks too deeply into why they're happy when they're happy. They're just happy that they're happy, right? But when you're experiencing anger or sadness, for example, not being able to think through that emotion and understand why you're feeling that way is really going to stunt your personal growth if you can't manage to do that. And that's been a challenge for me. Emotional self-awareness is an area of my life that I didn't even know that I didn't understand. For most of my life, I don't think I had a reason to really question or try to identify why I was feeling a certain way. And it's not often that people ask genuinely how you're feeling. And so I never had a reason to look inwards to find out. In my life, I'm more used to being asked what I think as opposed to what I feel. And so I think I never really learned to differentiate between those two things. Being aware of what you feel and what emotions you're experiencing is very different from being aware of what your thoughts or your opinions are about something. I think often when I would have certain strong feelings throughout my life, I would, instead of expressing them, I would work on trying to change my perspective in order to overcome the emotion instead of embracing and leaning into the emotion. Emotions like anger or sadness, I would experience the emotion and judge what I'm feeling and then try to suppress it and separate myself from it instead of sitting with it and understanding it. I've never been someone that talks or expresses my emotions and my feelings very much. Throughout my life, I don't think I even had the emotional language to be able to express it. And I didn't know that I didn't have the emotional language. So of course, aside from not having an outlet to express the emotions, I didn't even know how, which is a major problem. When I am emotional, I often will use my words to try to disguise how I feel, even on a subconscious level. And the disguise often isn't very good. I mean, most people probably that know me, when I'm in that moment, they can probably see that I'm not being completely honest or completely open with what I'm feeling in that moment. And I think I've always been in denial of my emotional intelligence level, or my EQ as it's also called. Most of my life, I've always been competent without effort, with understanding every other area of my life. I guess I just assumed that your emotional intelligence develops naturally, assuming I even noticed it at all. And that's not true at all. Like unless your parents raised you with a very intent focus on developing your emotional awareness and expressing and understanding how you feel, a lot of people don't experience it at all. And I think it's a bigger challenge within society than we are aware of. And I'm only noticing it about myself now. And so I wonder how many other people are in the same situation. What I've started to learn better about emotional intelligence is that to develop it, not only do you have to be able to monitor your emotions all the time as they're going on, but you have to be able to identify them, to pick them out and understand what emotion you're experiencing. And even furthermore, identify how that emotion is impacting the way you show up and you react in your everyday life. And I think, although of course we all experience that, to intentionally be aware of it is something that I haven't even been putting enough focus into. The main reason I think is because I'm not a very super emotional person to begin with. So most people never get to see just how shitty my emotional intelligence is. And because of that, I don't even get to see my emotional intelligence in action because it's so infrequent that I even have an opportunity to see it. There's actually only one experience that has been consistent throughout my life that allowed me to realize that my ability to communicate effectively is not very good when my emotions are high. And that's when I'm playing basketball. I've always said, I remember always saying throughout my life that the basketball court is like my self-control training zone. What it really is my emotional intelligence training zone. I just didn't have the language to even identify that when I was growing up. When playing basketball, at least in my experience, there's nothing but competition and ego and testosterone in the air. And it's often, people yelling or calling fouls, or somebody else is arguing the foul. And I always remember when I'm involved in it, my emotional experience gets too high. My mind gets clouded and I'm unable to really express what I want to say. My mouth stops working effectively because my brain stops working effectively. And I've never really understood why. And it's only recently that I started putting the puzzle pieces together and connecting the dots to understand how this all plays into my emotional intelligence. So it's been somewhat of a revelation for me on my personal journey. So here's a cool thing that I learned in recent years, just through general reading. In those moments when my mind is clouded, when I get emotional, I'm the victim of an experience or a phenomenon called an amygdala hijack. So the amygdala is the part of the brain that is responsible for regulating emotions. And it's the part of the brain that puts you into a fight or flight kind of reaction, right? And for me, when my emotion gets high, the amygdala pumps like adrenaline really hard into my body, and it makes me basically go on an adrenaline high. And that affects my ability to think. So during an amygdala hijack, the amygdala, that part of your brain, hijacks control of your mind basically. And it kind of turns off your frontal lobe, the part of your brain that's responsible for rational and thoughtful thinking. So that's why my mind always felt cloudy. My frontal lobe, the part of my mind that was responsible for the thoughtful person that I usually am, gets like turned way down. And the amygdala, the very primitive part of our brains that's responsible for fighting or running or freezing or trying to protect itself, that gets turned up. And for me, my reaction is to go into like almost like a fight mode. So I'm not thinking, it's just about like surviving. So as you'd imagine, while you're angry is a terrible time for the rational and thoughtful part of your brain to turn off. And that leads people, including definitely myself, when they're angry or they're at an emotionally heightened level, to almost resort to like a childlike attitude. And that's where we start getting into yelling and name calling and just being almost like this emotionally immature. So maybe you've experienced this before, and like this might be enlightening for you, because it was to me. I had no idea that this was going on in my brain. And it's something that a lot of people deal with, I think, unexpectedly. They have no idea. Luckily, it's not a frequent experience that I have, and I've never done anything that I truly deeply regret in those experiences. I've never went to jail. I've never hurt somebody, at least not physically. What it's allowed me to do is to understand why some people do extremely irrational things when their emotions are high. When they're mad, they're angry, when they're deeply like in love, like people do really emotional things because there's an amygdala hijack going on. Maybe you heard in the past how at the Oscars, Will Smith went up and smacked Chris Rock for saying something about making a joke about his wife. That's a perfect example of an amygdala hijack. Will Smith is a thoughtful, self-aware dude, but when he got really angry or felt really offended or his emotions acted up, he went and did something that no one would have expected him to do. And not to say that is acceptable, but I understand it now. I can understand. It's not confusing to me. I understand why it happened. And that level of understanding has really aided me just in my own personal development journey. When I'm experiencing a high level of emotion, personally, it's very hard for me to pretend like I'm not emotional. I think it's pretty obvious. And the only kind of loophole that I've used throughout my life to get around that is to be silent in those moments. And it's kind of my not so effective loophole because it's not effective because it doesn't solve anything. It doesn't help you learn about yourself, and it doesn't get rid of the problem. If I'm in a situation where I feel like I have to respond, or someone's just continually pushing my buttons to the point that I feel like I have to say something, as soon as those floodgates of communication open up while I'm in a high emotional state, that's when my dummy communication comes out, and all of a sudden my mind's all fogged up and I have no idea what I'm going to say. Like, I'm not aware of what I said until after I've said it. My vocabulary and my thoughtfulness, it just disappears. And then I get reduced to the emotional maturity of like a 10-year-old. So if I'm in a situation where I'm frustrated or I'm irritated or I don't want to communicate, my strategy has always just been to either leave or just to be absolutely silent, because I know that if I start talking, I don't know how long I can maintain my composure. And it becomes obvious to everyone else, and then more focus comes on you, and then your emotional state goes higher, and then you become even more of an emotional dummy, and it creates this circle, this twister of emotional immaturity. On the flip side, people with high emotional intelligence, if they're in a situation like that, people might not even know they're irritated, because they're already aware of their emotion, they're aware of what's causing it, they're able to maintain their composure and hold themselves, be responsible for themselves, maintain a certain level of rational thinking, and then once they moved away from the situation, be able to analyze it, express themselves the way they actually want to express themselves, apologize if they need to apologize. And like for me, it's challenging. After several months of really starting to understand and reflect on this whole topic, what I realized is that growing up in my immediate environment, my immediate kind of friend group, they also didn't have great emotional intelligence. They didn't have the great ability to be able to monitor their emotions and identify it and be able to understand how those emotions are completely impacting the way they're acting during those high emotional states. So we always hear growing up to be careful who you surround yourself with. It's not just a simple cliche quote. It has a lot of depth to it. And sometimes you don't realize how people have an impact on you until decades later, which I believe in at least a small part plays a role in my life right now as well. The more I watched videos and Googled and started to understand the different signs of emotional intelligence or the lack thereof, the more I saw myself reflected in those definitions. For example, one thing that I realized about myself through really researching into emotional intelligence and what it means is that oftentimes I'm kind of subconsciously blaming people for the way I feel. Even if it's just in my mind. I might not tell anybody about it, but in my mind I'm blaming them in part for how I feel. And the problem with that is that when you're doing that, you're blaming them, which means you're not taking responsibility for yourself, which means you never address the part of you that is leading to that. And it becomes very damaging to yourself and sometimes to other people that you interact with that are around you. Or sometimes as a result of suppressing my emotions or bottling my emotions up, it leads to emotional outbursts in the form of raised voice or agitation or just snappy reactions to things. And that's a result of me sometimes not in a moment that I'm feeling agitated, not understanding the agitation and identifying the emotion and communicating with the people around that may be indirectly contributing to that irritation. For example, if I'm in my room and I'm reading or I'm watching a video or maybe I'm editing a video I've made, if I hear Danielle in the other room watching something but the volume's too loud, instead of taking the time to acknowledge and understand what's going on in my mind and going to expressing to her, like, hey, I need you to turn the volume down, please, for example. Instead of doing that, I'll sit there and I'll let the irritation build up. I'll let the agitation build up. And I'm kind of trying to suppress the emotion and push it away. And you just can't do that. And so later on, at a moment that doesn't make sense, maybe I'll start raising my voice or I'll seem angry or agitated for no reason. And then of course that can lead to arguments or disagreements or small little petty fights, and it builds up. So I realize just how much that exists within me, emotional outbursts at weird times, and it's something that I've been focusing really hard on trying to acknowledge as it's happening and try to stop before it happens. Because the reality is, it's embarrassing the odd time it happens. It makes me feel kind of ashamed of myself. And usually I'm not experiencing that shame or embarrassment as it's happening, but once my emotions calm down and I have time to think and I get my clarity back, I look back on what just happened and it's like, man, that's not me. That's not who I want to be, and I feel embarrassed about it. I also came to realize how insensitive I can be to other people's feelings or emotional states, particularly when it doesn't involve me. I talked a little bit more about that in my previous video about being an introvert, so you can watch that to get a little bit more in-depth understanding on that. And so I think because of my kind of general lack of emotional awareness, not only have I had so far the inability to really monitor and understand my emotions as it's happening in order to react in a way that I'd approve of, when someone else is experiencing a high emotional state and I'm engaged in some form, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to act or what to do, even if they're expressing happiness. If someone's really happy over something, oftentimes I don't know what to say. I don't know how to act. I don't know what to do. Do I shake your hand and jump with you? I don't know. And so I think the more I develop my emotional intelligence, it will improve the way I'm able to interact with other people when they're emotional and understand them better. Through my readings, I learned that people with low emotional intelligence, they tend to struggle and have a really hard time in relationships. And although I know that everyone has their challenges in relationships, me being with Danielle, I think is what really opened me up to learning about this in my own emotional intelligence levels, because she has really high emotional intelligence. She's worked very long to develop that. I haven't, and I think our interactions has really forced me to look at myself in a way that I never really had before. And the more I think about it, the more I realize the occasional little petty fights and arguments that me and Danielle have, it would either not have started in the beginning, or it would have at least ended a lot earlier if my emotional intelligence was developed to the level that hers is at. I think in like 80% of our fights or little petty arguments, it's really my fault that it goes that far because my sensitivity around my ego. And even though I don't ever think that it's my fault in the moment, the more I look back on it and the more I think about it, it's like, yeah, it's my fault. If I had a better grasp on my emotions, it wouldn't have resulted in me acting or reacting or saying the things I say and leading to the arguments in the first place. As you might expect, this all makes it very hard for me to apologize for something that I might have done or said, especially if in the moment I've convinced myself that I'm justified in what I said in the first place. So what ends up happening in my life is that after the argument has died down and my emotions come back down, I have the clarity back and I start thinking about the situation and I realized it's my fault, I should say sorry. But then a part of me stands up and says, no, you shouldn't say sorry. I start reflecting on the situation that happened. And then as I'm thinking about it, my emotions go back up and then my clarity goes away. And then I convince myself not to apologize. And of course, this isn't healthy for me. And it's certainly not healthy to have in a relationship. And the only time I really realize I do apologize is if I do something accidentally. If I step on someone's toe, if I bump somebody by accident, if I do something unintentionally, because it doesn't require me to look inwards and evaluate myself. It really wasn't until meeting her that I heard the term emotional intelligence used. And that kind of set me down slowly, very slowly, but it planted the seeds for me to start looking inwards and questioning my own emotional intelligence. And throughout the journey of our relationships, I've seen that play out for better and for worse, and really started to get a good idea about what it means and where I lack it in my life. I started taking her word for it instead of denying it every time she bring it up. And through this all, I really started to understand why you sometimes hear people say that they would rather be with somebody who's had previous long-term relationship experience. Because when you're in a relationship, there's a lot of nuances you have to navigate and you have to learn to develop. You have to learn how to communicate with someone you're living with. You have to learn how to communicate with someone that you're going to disagree with, but you don't want to isolate yourself with because you want to continue a relationship with. Right? You learn the little nuances and how to share a space and cohabitate and share chores and understand responsibilities with each other. It's an experience that I'm really realizing it's important to have. And for me, I never had, previous to this relationship, a previous long-term relationship that allowed me to develop the emotional intelligence and understanding that is so very important when you're trying to build a life with somebody. I think my biggest challenge is my ego. I do have a pretty big ego. And so when I feel that someone is trying to offend me or disrespect me, my body goes into that fight mode because that amygdala hijack starts to kick in. And then all of a sudden, my emotions raise, my rational thinking goes out the window, and then all my body cares about doing is going into this mode where I'm defending myself or I'm going on the offensive in order to kind of battle it out. Oftentimes through words or posturing. It's really interesting how modern human beings still have that survival instincts built into us, where if we perceive a threat, we either go into like fight or flight mode. In my case, it's like fight. Our emotions and our body and our adrenaline and the chemicals in our body start reacting as if we're preparing for actual battle, if we're actually getting ready to fight for our life. And then it's only after that's gone that our rational mind takes back control and obviously understands that there's no danger here. Someone said some mean words to you and they offended your ego. Your life wasn't threatened. You don't need the adrenaline to start pumping and getting ready to fight for your life. It's such a weird thing that humans still have. Or maybe it's just me, I don't know. The ego is a very powerful, yet such a fragile and sensitive part of our being. Honestly, a lot of the videos I make, including this one, I don't make it because I want to. I don't make it because I enjoy doing it. I make it because it's not comfortable. It's not really enjoyable to dig into my own insecurities and come face to face with it, come to terms with the parts of myself that I don't feel are at a good enough level. And then not only come to terms with it, but also make a video and talk about it and share it with the world. And I know I don't have to, but I think it's almost like therapy for me to go through the process of making a video on a topic about myself, particularly a part of myself that I think needs some work. I've never seen a therapist formally before, but I think I'd really enjoy it because their whole purpose is to help guide you through your own self-awareness journey and help you navigate the thoughts and experiences and emotions of your own mind and help you overcome your own obstacles. I think that's a cool job. I think that's a cool career and lifestyle to have. And I can see myself being a therapist in a different life. What I've learned over the years I didn't realize had anything to do with emotional intelligence is that there's meaning behind our emotions. Every emotion that we feel, every emotion that you have in your life, there's a story behind it. There's a meaning that you've placed behind it. Sometimes those stories are true. It's what actually happened. But sometimes those stories are not true. It's something that we fabricated in our own mind. But whether true or false, our emotions respond to that. And those emotions lead into how we react and act in our everyday life. So by developing our emotions, we can learn to differentiate between what's real and what's made up in our mind. And of course, doing that, we improve our ability to be aware of those emotions and acknowledge them and interact with them in a way that's going to benefit us instead of us remaining in a stagnant, angry, or mad place and holding those emotions in for an indefinite amount of time or until they burst out in completely unnecessary situations. I remember hearing like 15 years ago that our thoughts lead to emotions, our emotions lead to actions. And so by getting control over our thoughts and understanding our thoughts, it is able to help us manage all aspects of our life. And that's one kind of concept that I've always remembered. And that's one of the things that really helped me to do the level of managing I have in my life in regards to being self-aware and trying to understand why I do things when I do them. It's worth mentioning, and this is something that I've had to learn over time, is that there's nothing wrong with experiencing any emotion. Like there's nothing wrong with being angry. There's nothing wrong with being sad or feeling shame. That has nothing to do with having low emotional intelligence. The thing that needs to be addressed is how we let those emotions change our perspective on things in the world and how we let those emotions affect how we communicate and how we respect people around us. And more importantly, how we let those emotions affect the way we communicate and interact and love ourselves. There's a whole story behind that, but I've let that get to me sometimes. And I think in a way that's why I've prevented myself or tried to prevent myself from feeling or experiencing or embracing certain emotions throughout my life. I think a lot of communities and societies and civilizations around the world has really failed so many generations of children that were led to believe that understanding and expressing your emotions was specifically a feminine trait. This idea that men are supposed to be calm and under control and not expressing emotions. Saying to children that are crying, like real men don't cry, like these things have probably prevented a lot of people from being able to explore themselves emotionally and to understand themselves on a much deeper level. As a result, you have men all over the world who never cry, who never embrace an emotion when it creeps up inside of them, that never sit there and understand how they truly feel because they're so focused on pushing it away and trying to fulfill this role and this mold of how a man is supposed to be. I can count on my fingers how many times I've cried in the past 20 years. And it probably wasn't because I didn't want to, it's probably because I convinced myself that I'm not supposed to. As a 32-year-old man, I'm at a place in life where I have to intentionally try to express the wider array of emotions that I feel. It doesn't even come naturally to me anymore, the way it does when you're a child. That's pretty sad. And I think a lot of people feel that way. I don't think it's just me. I think you have a lot of people secretly hiding and feeling like their emotions are a weakness or a disadvantage, as opposed to something that is a significant part of who they are. Not only do men get discouraged from expressing emotions in society, but you still need to be taught how to express emotions, which means learning the emotional language and being asked questions throughout your life that leads to emotional introspection, which of course leads to emotional understanding and the ability to express your emotions effectively. This is something that certainly me, but I think a lot of people never had the foundation to do in the first place. I think ideally, when you ask a child or even any adult, when you ask them, how are you feeling today? Everyone should be able to come up with a very clear, concise, and well understood answer to that. But if at any given time somebody asks me how I'm feeling, I'm probably just gonna give like a canned answer, like many people do, and not actually go inwards and monitor how I feel to give a true and honest response, assuming that people are looking for a true and honest response, like a friend or a family member or something. Like humans have a really hard time differentiating between what happened and what they tell themselves happened. And then what happens is that those human beings that never really learned to differentiate between that, they grew up to be 20, 30, 40, 50, 80-year-old adults, and they never learned to do anything different. They view the world through the same perspective, and you have people that are in leadership positions with the same mindset. And it's something that I don't want to allow myself to be a victim of anymore, a victim of my own limited emotional understanding. There's this quote I've had on the top of my whiteboard for several months now. You never interact with the goal. You can only interact with the process. And this is something that I've really repeated in my mind a lot because it affects so many different areas of our lives. When it comes to emotional intelligence, the same is true. You're never interacting with the goal of understanding your emotions better. You're only interacting with the process of being in moments of high stress or high emotion and having to actively monitor what you're feeling and monitor why you're feeling that way and acknowledge that the way you're feeling doesn't have to come out in the form of the way you react and respond and the things you say to people. And the more we interact with that process of going through those hard experiences, the more we get better at expressing ourselves and improving our emotional intelligence. But you can't interact with the goal of being a good communicator or being emotionally intelligent. That doesn't mean anything. We have to interact with the process. And that's been my problem. Not interacting enough with the process. Not going through moments that are challenging for me emotionally and actually working through it. Instead, I just let the emotion take over me and I say what I say or do what I do or feel what I feel and it ends there. That's not the way I want to go about life. Of course, it's all easier said than done. And for me, the amygdala hijack experience is a big challenge for me. It has to be a constant practice. For people with lower emotional intelligence, trying to think while in a heightened state is like trying to walk through a house of smoke and mirrors. Not only is it hard to see through the smoke, but you're constantly bumping into things. When we start to improve our self-awareness, we start to gain some clarity and we get to see what we're actually bumping into. And that's when you see a reflection of yourself in those mental mirrors. And you realize that it's you getting in your own way. The unfortunate part is that some people go their whole life without having a better relationship with their emotions, without developing their emotional intelligence. They'll go their whole life blaming everyone else for their shitty situations, for their bad relationship history that just never seemed to work out, for their inability to communicate with people effectively, the people they love and the people that they don't love. They'll think that the whole universe was out to get them, not realizing that it was an inability to look within the whole time and manage the hard part, to look yourself in the mirror and realize you're not perfect. You're not without flaws. You have work to do. Just because you're an adult and you finish school, things just didn't magically get put in order. We're a work of art that constantly need to be chipped away at and improved. I think sometimes I realized that I stopped working on myself. I stopped trying to improve, or I stopped trying to improve that side of me, the emotional side, the feeling and the self-awareness side. The reality is that self-sabotage, whether it's subconscious or conscious, it's a real thing. And I don't want to be that person anymore that creates excuses for why certain parts of me are not the way that I want it to be. What I've learned about myself through this whole experience the past few months, but really the past few years, I'm intentional about being self-aware and developing every area of my being, every area of my life, except the emotional part. For some reason, I chose not to develop that part. That leads me to believe that something happened in my life where it caused me to pivot. I kept on going forward with everything else, but I pivoted away from developing myself emotionally. I don't know what that event is. I don't know if I'll ever know. But I think through thinking about it more and reflecting, maybe the help of a therapist, maybe I'll start to understand a little bit better. Maybe I'll be able to connect the dots on where things went a little bit off track. I think the reality is that our emotions are extremely powerful and influential. And if we don't take the time to manage them and understand them, then the only option left is to fight them. And that's a battle that we'll lose every single time. It's just like trying to go up against and fight a wave when you're in the ocean. You really can't do it. You're gonna lose that battle. But if you learn how to manage it, then you can surf on it. It can bring value to you. You can have fun. Because you're able to work with the emotion, work with the wave instead of trying to battle against it. And once we get to that point in our life, that's when you find harmony, and also known as, improved emotional intelligence, improved self-awareness. I genuinely look forward to continuing to improve myself, as difficult as it is. Mainly because I want to see how it develops who I am as a whole and how it impacts different areas of my life. But most importantly, to experience the peace that it brings to my experience of life. Because for myself, and I think a lot of people, maybe you relate, dealing with the emotional roller coaster of life is very hard, it's chaotic. Sometimes it's torturous. And once we can get a hold, a grasp on that and understand how to manage it effectively, there's probably a certain level of peace that comes from that. Sometimes I think like monks, the stereotypical view of how monks are, it's like they're at peace. They're at peace because they've learned to manage themselves. And without becoming a monk, I'd like to kind of creep a little bit more towards that experience of life. I hope you're well on your way down this path of emotional self-awareness for yourself. And if by chance you weren't really familiar with emotional intelligence or the emotional journey the way I wasn't, I hope in some small way that this video was able to be a spark for you to start that journey and develop yourself and gain a good understanding about the emotional side of your being. I'd love to know your experience dealing with your emotions. Does your ego ever challenge you? How do you communicate when you're angry? Have you worked through your emotions, and what has been your experience and your process doing that? Let me know, I'd love to hear it. I appreciate you watching this video. I very much appreciate the little community we're developing here with this channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.